Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second. Okay, welcome everyone to Politics and Prose Live. We're here tonight with Jean Guerrero, who's going to discuss her new book, HATEMONGER, in conversation with Jonathan Blitzer. But before we get started, I just want to do some quick housekeeping notes. The first is that tonight's book is located in the chat. There's a link to purchase it from Politics and Prose's website, and we highly encourage everyone to purchase tonight's book. It's a great way to support our author and to also support Politics and Prose. We're doing $5 flat rate shipping, and we are also doing curbside pickup. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the latter portion of tonight's event will be dedicated to your questions, your audience questions. And to ask a question, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So you click on that and you can type in your question, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. There is a chat for you guys, but if you could just keep all of your questions in the Q&A, it just makes things a little bit easier. So with all that out of the way, it is my honor to introduce Jean Guerrero. She is an investigative reporter contributing to investigative border reporter contributing to NPR, the PBS NewsHour, and other public media. She is the author of Crux, a Cross-Border Memoir, which won the PEN Fusion Emerging Writers Prize. She is also the recipient of an Emmy for the KPBS series America's Wall. Tonight, she'll be discussing her new book, HATEMONGER, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. The book traces the ascent of Stephen Miller from spiteful teenage troll to one of Donald Trump's chief advisors. Miller, who has outlasted many others in the Trump orbit, has encouraged his boss's worst impulses and helped instill a racial and nativist animus in the White House. From the fear-stoking American carnage speech to the Muslim ban to the family separation policy at the border, Miller's fingerprints have been all over the cruelest and most divisive moments of the Trump era. Tonight, Jean will be in conversation with Jonathan Blitzer. Jonathan is a staff writer at The New Yorker. He also won the 2017 National Award for Education Reporting for American Studies, a story about an underground school for undocumented immigrants. His writing and reporting have also appeared in The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Atavist, Oxford American, and The Nation. So without any further ado, here are Jean and Jonathan.
Hello, everyone. Great.
Jean,
yeah, thank you guys, everyone. Thanks everyone for being here. And Jonathan, thanks for moderating. I'm super excited to talk to you about this book.
Well, likewise, and congratulations on it, first and foremost. I mean, this is a major undertaking.
Thank you.
And yeah, there's so much to say. So let me just launch right in. And I have a few ideas for how we might kind of move through the conversation to kind of capture the full sweep of what you've done here in the book. But before we kind of march through Miller's biography, I wanted to ask one kind of general sweeping question at the outset that may help serve to kind of orient people as they listen. And that's the following. Stephen Miller at this point is known to everyone. He's not a kind of retreating personality inside the Trump administration. He's notorious for all sorts of things. He's been involved in the most controversial policies adopted by the current administration. He's kind of enthusiastically and pridefully xenophobic, a real immigration hawk, all of this stuff. People have seen him on TV. People are used to seeing him raising his voice and being kind of pugnacious. My question to you is, what do you think the general public at this point and the media and its coverage of him, what have we all misunderstood? What aspects of his personality or his thinking are the least well understood given his outsized public persona?
Well, I would probably start with the fact that he has he had a lot of friends who perceived him to be really funny. He has this layered personality that's not really captured in a lot of accounts about Stephen Miller, where he's just sort of depicted as, the architect of Trump's anti-immigration policy, which he very much is. But in the book, I thought it was important to also show, how he's seen by his friends, many of whom point out that, he in many ways was a normal teenager growing up in Southern California. He was into reality TV show. He, really loved Elvis Presley and mobster movies. He would dress up as Robert De Niro's mobster character on trips to Las Vegas, which isn't, totally normal, but, just eccentric quirks that Stephen Miller had, and which made him, appear to be very funny to a lot of his friends. And, Stephen Miller, as obsessed as he has become with his anti-immigration agenda, he for a very long time in his life was capable of having friendships, with people who didn't necessarily agree with him. He has this ability to be civil, which you don't see coming across when you hear him, being very combative in his interviews with journalists. He's able to be laid back. He's able to be civil, and there were a lot of people who kind of found him to be funny because a lot of people thought he was joking, growing up, when he would say these very outrageous things about how racism is a figment of our imaginations and how multiculturalism poses an existential threat. They thought he was kind of joking. And it wasn't until, he joined the Trump campaign that people began to realize that this mission, had become inseparable from his identity and his self-perception. He really became fully consumed by his anti-immigration hostility and this, what I see as his radicalization, a true, case study in radicalization and what happens when someone's exposed to an extremist ideology at a young age and slowly becomes consumed by it and eventually becomes the most powerful advisor in the White House.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a fascinating point, and definitely something that's sort of fallen out of the popular imagination where Miller is concerned, that we all see him as this sort of bête noir, but there's a personality there, a big personality there. Just listening to you talk puts to mind a quote from one of his friends, just quoting from your book here. Miller's friend from, I believe, high school, says to you, quote, "What they're saying about him, about Miller, it's directionally accurate. I would just say, I think Stephen in reality is probably 2/3 of what you think of him in the media. If he's a 10 in the media, on whatever scale you're thinking, in reality, he's probably a 6 or a 7. How surprised were his friends, the friends of his whom you spoke with, that he became the figure that he did? I mean, were they, obviously by the time you got in touch with them, he was very much in the public eye, but did they describe feeling to you sort of shocked on seeing him for the first time, either warming up Trump during the 2016 campaign or on those early CNN appearances in 2017? Did this shock them? Did it upset them? I mean, the guy who gave you this quote himself actually seemed to be pretty self-reflexive about what it meant for him to have once been friends with Miller. So it did seem like there was some soul searching among his friends.
Yeah, I mean, this friend that you were quoting, he told me that he was very concerned about Stephen Miller at one point, when he was watching Stephen Miller start to get really a lot of national attention on the Trump campaign and in the White House as well. He would watch his friend on national TV, on CNN and things like that, battling with Jake Tapper. And he started to get really concerned about like what would happen if, what would happen long-term, what this would mean long-term for Stephen Miller's career. And at one point his friend, calls him up and says, "Are you sure that this is something that you want to be doing? Like, are you sure that this is right?" And Stephen Miller said that yes, he was sure, he wasn't worried. But yeah, his friends, they weren't surprised that he came into a position of power because they know how disciplined and hardworking Stephen Miller has been for his life and very ambitious, from the time he was in high school, appearing on talk radio show programs, just and being on national television when he was in college. So people weren't so much surprised that his friends who knew him well weren't very surprised by his rise to power. But there were some of them who expressed to me that they were concerned about what this would mean for him long term, because he was coming off as so, just as such a villain in the media.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And so let's start a bit with his childhood and a question of geography to begin with. I wonder what the early chapters of your book, I think, really smartly deal with California in some degree the late 80s, but mostly the 90s. And California as a state was this sort of staging ground for some of the ugliest and most virulent anti-immigration politics that the country saw. I wonder how much that shaped the Miller that we all know. I mean, so much of his childhood was defined by being this contrarian conservative in a community of liberals. But of course, there are plenty of conservatives nationwide who live in liberal enclaves. But it seemed to me that California, and specifically where he grew up in California, in Santa Monica, had a different kind of flavor. Would Miller be who he is now if he hadn't grown up in California? Tell us about that.
No, I think that, from my reporting for the book, it's clear that California played a central role in who Stephen Miller became, both in the brand of conservatism that he has, a very reactionary, combative conservative ideology that incorporates the language of the left into it, incorporating the language that liberals normally use and using it against them, like this notion of oppressive elites, being used to describe the Democratic Party, which has normally been used to describe, Republicans. And so there's the reactionary component where he uses a lot of the tools of the left and also is very combative in a way that reflects having grown up as a person whose ideology was a minority in the city in which he grew up and in the high school in which he grew up. But the other aspect of it, and this is kind of what drew me to tell Stephen Miller's story as someone who grew up in Southern California at the same time as Stephen Miller, just a couple hours south of where he lived. I remember there was this unprecedented anti-immigrant hostility statewide in California. And, I remember, there were attacks on affirmative action. There were attacks on bilingual education. There were attacks on social services for children of undocumented migrants. There was really this widespread statewide scapegoating that happened in that era where, Californians both Democrats and Republicans began to blame all of their problems, the state's fiscal problems, the national, crime problems on immigrants. And it is truly a microcosm, or was a microcosm, for what we're seeing nationally today as far as the white fear and white backlash and the resurgence of white supremacist ideologies. In California, when Stephen Miller grew up, white people became a minority for the first time in the state. And we're heading into that nationally. And so I believe we're kind of nationally going through the same growing pains that California underwent. But I mean, Stephen Miller, he was growing up, he was listening to this. I believe he was internalizing a lot of this racist rhetoric. I remember even me, as the daughter of a Mexican immigrant and a Puerto Rican mother, very much internalizing this shame associated with being Mexican. I mean, my mom used to say, you're American, you're not Mexican, you're not Puerto Rican, you're American. So in a way, I felt that I could bring, my perspective as someone who could relate to having internalized these views and relate with Stephen Miller and this desire to be seen as American with all of the privileges that that's supposed to guarantee to the book and kind of try to approach it with a really open mind. I didn't, want to come into it vilifying him. I came into it thinking maybe that Stephen Miller had been understood and really trying to understand him. And this is why the environment in which he grew up plays a central role in my book and turning that, into a character. And he was listening to Rush Limbaugh, who now is a huge, talk radio host, and at the time was less well known, but Stephen Miller was listening. He was broadcasting out of the state, railing against multiculturalism and pretty much, painting white men as the principal aggrieved party in America and saying that anyone else who complains lacks self-reliance. But white men, are allowed to complain about anything. And Stephen Miller was listening to this and really gravitated to it. Later on, he talks about reading Rush Limbaugh's books and finding them to be among the most formative in his life. And so even though he's a Jewish, he's a descendant of Jewish refugees, he really starts to associate with white men and whiteness.
And I want to ask about this because it was a real revelation to me reading your book. His father seemed to be kind of a major vector for Stephen in his childhood to begin to shift this sense of identification, going from a family of Jewish refugees to identifying with this kind of white minority in California under siege. Tell us a little bit about his father. It seemed like his father was, his father began, in your telling, as a kind of moderate Democrat, but who over time, it seemed like largely for personal reasons, a very conflictive person, was kind of embroiled in a series of lawsuits with his family, lawsuits with law partners, and that sense of aggrievement, while very personal and idiosyncratic, ended up maybe for Stephen being a kind of gateway into a broader sense of rage and anger. To tell us about his father.
Yeah, so his dad, this is when his father starts to rail against the, quote, ridiculous liberal elites. You see him start to express very conservative viewpoints when his real estate company is sort of falling apart, getting sued by his brother, suing his former law firm, and unsuccessfully, and in having all of these bankruptcies that he was dealing with, and being forced to move from a very affluent part of Santa Monica to a slightly smaller house in a more diverse area. And this is, when you see the shift in Stephen Miller's dad, that's when you start to see the shift in Stephen Miller himself, him going around. Well, one thing is that he had to go to Santa Monica High School, which is a very diverse public high school, whereas his younger brother would later attend a mostly white private high school. So Stephen Miller finds himself, displaced, feeling angry, feeling, like he's lost his place in line. And this is when you see him, breaking up with his Mexican friend, Jason Islas, telling him that he can't be friends with someone with a Latino heritage. And this is when you see him going around school, telling his Mexican classmates to go back to their countries, going into school board meetings to rail against measures to improve racial equity, really just expressing a lot of passion about these issues that you don't normally see a teenager getting that riled up about.
And his father too, I was shocked by this parallel to the current president and obviously Miller's current lodestar. His father, who was a lawyer by training, ended up leaving the law and entering real estate, of all things. And that also, just what a bizarre kind of antecedent to the present moment.
Yeah, his father is described to me as being very Trump-like, very combative. Some court documents that I found for the book describe him as a masterpiece of evasion and manipulation. So a lot of the same language that you see used to describe Trump and his business dealings. And, from the people that I spoke with for the book, they believe, people who know Stephen Miller believe that part of the reason he gets along so well with Donald Trump is that he gets him emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, because he grew up in a similar family to Donald Trump, not just with what we talked about with the lawsuits and the bankruptcies with his dad, but Stephen Miller's paternal uncle got permanently separated from the family with a no contact order in a settlement agreement. And deprived of most of the family inheritance after alleged bullying from Stephen Miller's father. So very much like what we see with Mary Trump, Donald Trump's niece. A lot of very striking parallels between the families that help to explain, Donald Trump's attraction to Stephen Miller and the part of the way that these men just kind of mutually understand each other and jibe.
Yeah. I just want to give people who are watching and listening in a little flavor of what some of this might have sounded like at home for a young Stephen Miller listening to his father. So this is from an interview you did with Stephen's uncle, his mother's brother, David Glosser, whom some people will know as a figure who's written publicly about his frustration with the turn that his nephew has taken. And here's David Glosser, Stephen's uncle, describing Stephen's father. He says that Stephen's father was a, quote, traditional economic Republican who over the years became more and more embittered over regulation and what he felt was the intrusion into his personal and business affairs by what he called the ridiculous liberal elite of the West Coast around California. He was convinced that American universities and colleges were more or less dominated by the extreme left-wing political view of the world. So, I mean, that, you know, you read a passage like that in your book, and that could as easily be a description, it seems to me, of Stephen. Were you yourself taken by some of these parallels? Did you know about some of this going in? As someone who's reported a lot on Stephen Miller, I have to say, this was really a total revelation to me. So I'd love to know a little bit more about how this came into view for you.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Miller kind of has this myth that he perpetuates in the media that he comes from this Democratic family and he helped to turn them into conservatives. But really, you know, from the court documents that I found and from my conversations with Stephen Miller's other relatives, it became clear that, you know, Stephen Miller didn't invent this ideology in his family. It came in large part from his relationship with his father. And you know, just hearing you read that passage just reminded me of how similar Stephen Miller's father's comments are to the comments of David Horowitz, who eventually, you know, meets Stephen Miller during this time in his life and really indoctrinates him in this idea that, you know, schools are these left-wing indoctrination machines and that they're contributing to the destruction of America because of, you know, the Democratic Party is allying itself with Muslims and other people of color who, according to Horowitz, pose an existential threat to America. So introduces Stephen Miller to this fantasy that he has to save the country from, you know, some kind of apocalypse that David Horowitz perpetuates. He nurtures young conservatives like Stephen Miller through his school for political warfare, and trains them to attack, you know, the civil rights movement with the language of the civil rights, and to launder white supremacist ideas through the language of heritage and the language of economics and the language of national security. And he introduces Stephen Miller to this idea that white men created everything that we hold dear in America, you know, from equality to freedom, which ignores the central role that people of color have played in our history and is obviously ahistorical, but which appealed to Stephen Miller at a young age and you know, just ended up taking over his life. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I have a lot of questions for you about David Horowitz, and I'm also tempted to ask one final question about Miller's childhood. So let me just, before we dive even sort of headlong into the Horowitz stuff, which is obviously so important, and it makes a lot of sense to me to connect up the way Miller's father sounds to the kind of rhetorical platform that David Horowitz offers him later on. I just want to ask one thing, because this actually really struck me in some of the reporting I've done on Miller over the years. Someone once told me, someone who worked with Miller at the Department of Homeland Security once told me, in response to a question I had about kind of what animated Miller's racism toward immigrants, you know, how that could be explained. And the person said to me that Miller, and this is a direct quote, that Miller sees immigrants, and particularly refugees and asylum seekers, as rabble. That was the quote that this person gave me. And I thought about it a bit reading your book, because there is one formative experience in his childhood, which you've already alluded to, but which I want to hear a little bit more on, which is the Miller family moves during Stephen's childhood, basically from a kind of, as you've already described, a kind of like particularly wealthy enclave in Santa Monica to one that's a little bit more racially and economically diverse. And it's seen as a real come down for the Millers as a family. And I wonder how much some of the views he has toward immigrants also has this kind of class conscious overlay. Was that something that struck you, having dug into his childhood to the extent that you have?
You know, that is a really excellent question, because I do think that it's very tangled up in Stephen Miller's head, this racism with this sense of elitism and classism. one of the first kind of racist thoughts that he expresses is really more classist than racist. He talks about how he hates his Latin American housekeeper dropping him off at school because it makes him look poor, because he referred to her junky car and how embarrassing it was for him to have to get dropped off at school by her because it made him feel poor. And it's just so interesting because Stephen Miller has been so effective at casting the Democratic Party as elites, globalist elites who want to, quote, decimate America with limitless importation of cheap labor, through mass migration into this country. And meanwhile, Stephen Miller, he enjoys wandering around in his bathrobe and having leather books, and he has a glass window condominium and like in a very nice, complex in DC. And he embodies elitism in a very conscious way. But he's able to deflect, with those tools that he learned from a very young man and cause people to see Trump as sort of the only person who can fight against these elites, even though Trump himself also is very clearly an elite.
I mean, you couldn't have, one of the things that's so striking reading this book just straight through is that the arrival of Trump is like, you couldn't have scripted it better from a Millerite standpoint. I mean, it really is the kind of culmination of all of these different sort of strands of his childhood and college years, all of the things that you're describing. And one big question I have for you, and one big question I know I and others have wrestled with too, trying to report on Miller. You mentioned David Horowitz, the conservative activist, and you describe him so well, both in our conversation and in the book, as someone who really kind of preyed on this sense of white grievance and tried to turn the language of the left against the left. And Miller became a quick study in that department. You quote a friend of Miller's in college who says the following: some people want money, some people want power, some people want influence, some people want women, some people want scientific discovery, and a lot of people run around not knowing what they want. Stephen very clearly wanted the tears of his enemies and then went out and got them. So this is a college friend of Miller's. And the reason I bring this quote up in particular is I wanted to ask you at what point it seems like Miller actually comes to an ideology, because for many of these years, his childhood, his high school years, even for the most part, as I can tell from your book, during much of his college experience, so much of what animates him is this kind of trolling sensibility of just kind of going straight for the jugular of liberals. But I'm wondering if there is actually an ideological worldview, something that is kind of practicable as a policy platform. And when that starts to take shape, does that happen when he moves to Capitol Hill and works for Jeff Sessions as a staffer? Does it happen later? Like, when does he make this conversion from, grievance politics to actual kind of policy ideas?
So I don't think this was a clear turning point for Stephen Miller. I think it's slowly, like, as he began to realize how effective this was for gaining attention and for gaining power, it slowly starts to become more and more ingrained in his identity, and he becomes more invested in the ideology and is less able to kind of, question it or question himself, or to do it in a laid back way. And if there is a turning point that I can identify, I would probably say it was at Duke University when he was, there was this Duke lacrosse scandal that probably a lot of people have heard about, where a Black stripper accuses Duke lacrosse players of raping her. And the charges were eventually dropped. But during the investigation, Stephen Miller was repeatedly defending these players as being, vilified and targeted only because of their white skin color. And I think when the charges were dropped, it was a kind of a point in Stephen Miller's head where it was like confirming for him that he had been right all along, and just further ingraining these beliefs that Horowitz had introduced him to, which is, Horowitz says that the only real racism, the only important racism in society is racism against whites. Racism against brown and Black people is a figment of your imagination. according to Horowitz. And Stephen Miller, I think that when he began to get, national TV attention and then decided that he'd been right all along as far as the Duke Lacrosse scandal, I think this is when it starts to become a true ideology ingrained in his character. He invested so much in it and was getting so much out of it, eventually got his first jobs in Congress, and eventually lands on the Trump campaign and eventually in the White House. So the more it provides for him, the more necessary it becomes for his self-perception. I truly believe that there's a big part of him that believes that he's truly protecting Americans from some, grave threat in the form of too many brown and Black people coming here. And I will say, obviously Stephen Miller would say that this has nothing to do with race, that this has nothing to do with skin color. But when you connect the dots between what he's doing and saying and where he's drawing the policies from and the rhetoric from, the white supremacist literature, the white nationalist literature, it becomes very clear that what is motivating him.
I mean, there's no denying that he's extremely intelligent, and that he's a quick study, whether it's just in kind of combative politics or actual policy. And I know immigration wonks and experts wince to hear this said, but he is, for all of the apparent failures of the Trump administration with regard to immigration policy, for all of the messiness of the travel ban orders, for all of the controversy of family separation, I do think it has to be said that Miller has been wildly successful. How does he do this? How does he hit the ground running when he joins the Trump administration? I mean, he's going up against people who should be outgunning him in every sense. And yet he manages to get to force through what he wants, whether it's lowering the refugee ceiling, whether it's forcing through, regulations on public charge. I mean, he is working the bureaucracy. What's your sense of where that came from?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say, I feel like he kind of often will get the Karl Rove treatment, like he's the brains behind Trump. And I think it's important to distinguish between that and what's actually going on with Stephen Miller, where Stephen Miller is not like some kind of mastermind who is inventing all of this stuff himself or coming up with it. What makes Stephen Miller so effective is, in part his discipline and his work ethic, but also he's just so skilled at regurgitating the talking points and the ideas of other people. He's got a great skill for memorization and mimicry. And also he's just really good at networking, throughout the Trump campaign. Because of his relationship with David Horowitz. I mean, David Horowitz was, from the emails that I obtained for the book, you see David Horowitz feeding, explosive talking points to Stephen Miller for Trump that, you would see Trump regurgitating later, like this whole, insisting on saying radical Islam and radical Islamic terrorism. This was a Horowitz suggestion. And, so part of what makes Stephen Miller so effective is he's, the other thing is, from those emails, Horowitz sent him a strategy paper that talks about the importance of demonization and inciting fear and other hostile emotions to rally people around, an agenda. So Stephen Miller knows how to use that. But yeah, the other, I mean, obviously then there's the strategy within the White House where Stephen Miller, he has a great relationship with Donald Trump because he's been so useful to him from the beginning. He helped him get the Border Patrol and ICE union endorsements during the campaign that were so important for his victory. And it really just cemented his status as a key player early on. So Trump trusts him. The other thing about Stephen Miller is comfortable in Trump's shadow. He never gets out ahead of Trump the way you saw Steve Bannon, for example. Steve Bannon is obsessed with media attention. He loves to self-mythologize through the press and kind of exaggerate his credentials and his role in shaping Trumpism, whereas Stephen Miller has always tried to lurk in the background and cast himself constantly as a devoted vehicle for Trump's agenda and trying to make sure that Trump always gets the credit for whatever successes that they're experiencing. So there's that. And then, Stephen Miller also repeatedly kind of found ways to bypass the bureaucracy, reaching deep into the bowels of the Department of Homeland Security to push through his agenda, and really just, disregarding the input of national security experts, and making sure that the political agenda that he had with Trump is what was made into a reality.
Well, it's been described to me that he has essentially over the years really kind of gutted DHS leadership. I mean, it's gotten to a point where, to circumvent kind of established policy channels, he has just replaced wholesale people who were experienced and who had kind of definite views about the way government should be working, and replaced them with loyal acolytes. I guess a question I have too, and this follows from what you said about, everyone kind of attributes to Miller this kind of omnipotence inside the administration. Obviously, he relies on a group of co-conspirators for one thing, and for another, he also exploits what's the exact word for it? The kind of apathy or lack of interest of other parties inside the administration on immigration policy. So he's able to really drill down because other people maybe just have their attention divided. Mm-hmm. Who do we need to know about to understand Miller and Miller's success? Like, who would you describe as the kind of key cast around him?
Well, one of the key players is Gene Hamilton, who he met during his time working for Jeff Sessions and helped to bring into the White House, and who's played an instrumental role at the Department of Justice and kind of working together with the Department of Homeland Security to implement this anti-immigration agenda. But, over the years, Stephen Miller has actually become increasingly, even though he continues to draw from the ideas of other people, he's getting some hostility from people who used to be allies of his, because he's seen as trying to have sole control over the anti-immigration agenda, and in the process, pushing out people that were effective, at implementing it as well. For example, Francis Sisna, who was at the head of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services until Stephen Miller decided that he was taking too long to push through the public charge regulation, and he decided, to get rid of him. And so over the years, he's become, he's become so obsessed with being the number one expert on this issue for Trump that he's, people like Ann Coulter, who used to love and fawn over Stephen Miller, now are kind of angry that he's pushed so many restrictionists out so that he can continue to have control over the issue, largely with a core group of people, who are young like himself, like Gene Hamilton and, Julia Hahn, and others as well.
Yeah. No, it's so true. He's become a kind of one-man show. What would you say? So two final questions, and I want to open this up for others to ask. So two final questions. The first is, I'd love to get your sense, given your expertise in these matters generally, and then also specifically your knowledge about Stephen. What would you say if you had to kind of come up with a list of his major accomplishments over these last 4 years? What would you say is the kind of are the key highlights for him? What will he be able to come away from a first term saying he's done? And how should we understand that?
Well, he has largely succeeded in his effort to re-engineer the demographics of this country, of trying to re-engineer the ethnic flows into this country, mostly through, from the very beginning, cracking down on refugee admissions, slashing refugee admissions to new historic lows every year. And part of his obsession with refugee admissions is tied to his relationship with David Horowitz and the fact that, a large portion of refugees are Muslims and come from Muslim majority countries. And so this idea that Muslims pose some kind of threat to America really, pushed Stephen Miller to destroy the United States' reputation internationally as a beacon of hope and refuge for people fleeing violence and persecution. They've dismantled this infrastructure that is going to take years to rebuild, if ever. So I think that's one. He has succeeded very well with obliterating refugee admissions into the United States.
Yeah.
He hasn't gotten it to zero as he would like, but he's made a big dent.
Damn close. Yeah.
And the other, I
Yeah.
mean, the other key thing that Stephen Miller has done is he has obliterated the asylum system at the US-Mexico border. I mean, it started initially with, the executive orders from January 2017, where they expand, Border Patrol and ICE officers' ability to keep people detained and to deport people, and no longer, prioritizing, serious criminals, but instead trying to keep everyone detained as what they saw as a deterrence strategy in order to make people no longer want to come here. And then, over the years, then you saw the systematic separation of children from their parents, which, even though that was, eventually struck down as a policy, it did have its intended effect of, traumatizing hundreds of families, many parents who were deported without their children, many children who were, permanently traumatized. And this was part of the, just creating a show of cruelty in order to deter more family immigration from Central America. And then eventually with the migrant protection protocols, where they force asylum seekers to wait their court proceedings in Mexico, and now what we're seeing in response to the pandemic, where they're essentially turning everyone away at the US-Mexico border. So I think his two main accomplishments have been to target people, fleeing violence, either through the refugee system, where they are very deeply vetted and go through, this very long process to come here, as well as with the asylum system, just completely obliterating access to that. I would say
and you said it. Oh yeah, sorry. I just want to, you said at the start of your answer, I think aptly, that he has really managed, by pulling various policy levers, to change the racial composition of those who enter the country or attempt to enter the country. And that specifically leads me to my final question for you before we open this up, which is Stephen Miller a white nationalist? How do you, you've been swimming around in this murk for a while. Definitionally, is that his identity? Is that his worldview? Do we need to be kind of more forthright in our writing and thinking about the extent to which he is a white nationalist who propounds white nationalist racist ideology?
Yeah, so he would obviously deny that he is a white nationalist, but I think it's much harder for him to not deny that he is implementing a white nationalist agenda. So regardless of whether he identifies as a white nationalist or not, the policies that he's put in place were derived from white nationalist people and think tanks that exist, that were created to have population control for non-white people, because the white supremacists who funded these organizations that he drew his policy from believe, in the genetic superiority of whites, and that America has to be a majority white country in order to preserve its unique culture and privileges. And so yeah, that kind of speaks to like the tie that you were talking about between classism and racism for Stephen Miller. Anyway, I lost my train of thought, but
No. I just want, I just.
Oh, the white not okay. Yeah, I can finish answering your question.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to call out the white nationalist agenda for what it is. I think that, as journalists, like we've sort of allowed white nationalist and white supremacist ideas to spread within our governmental institutions by not calling it what it is, and by allowing these organizations to launder their ideas through the language of heritage and economics and national security. But I called the book HATEMONGER because I didn't write this book to tell you that Stephen Miller has hate in his heart, that he hates Mexicans, that he hates Muslims, because I can't tell you that. I think that as journalists, we have refrained from using terms like racist to describe people because we don't know what's in people's hearts. And I can't tell you what is in Stephen Miller's heart, But what I can tell you is he's fluent in hate. He has deliberately been inciting hate and playing with the emotion of hatred in order to become more powerful and to rally people around his anti-immigrant agenda. So, I mean, if you look at the documents that he's worked on and where he's being inspired, it becomes clear that hate mongering is a central aspect of everything that he does.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I hate to say that's a nice note to end on. It's of course terrifying. But bear with me 1 second. I just want to now call up some questions. Bear with me 1 sec. So just so everyone knows, as they see me squinting on my computer, I'm just sifting through questions that people have posted on the Q&A window. One question someone's asked is Miller more powerful than Kushner? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And I'm also going to simultaneously be digging for other questions. So okay. Miller, Kushner, where does Miller fit in the White House hierarchy?
Yeah, a lot of people describe Kushner as being the most powerful advisor. And I would argue that Stephen Miller holds more sway over Trump, because for Trump, his primary goal is to be reelected in November. And Trump believes that Stephen Miller knows his base, and that Stephen Miller is the reason that he won in 2016, and that if he wants to win again in 2020, that he needs to lean heavily on Stephen Miller and to trust him, and from the very beginning of Stephen Miller's time in the White House, he, was working on using demonization to support his policies. One of the first things he did was create an office dedicated to the daily demonization of immigrants, issuing press releases about their crimes. And anyway, this kind of language of demonization in order to rally support, whether for an agenda or for a candidate, is something that has proved very useful for Trump so far. And so this is his central agenda. Immigration has been his central agenda. And I think he's going to maybe expand it a little bit more into just a more general demonization of anyone, who opposes him, which is part of what we're seeing now with DHS going after anti-racist, protests in Portland.
Right.
But yes, I would argue Stephen Miller is his most powerful advisor.
Interesting. Okay, here's another question. This is from Mark Hetfield. Very good question. I'm just going to read it verbatim. Did the attack against the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and the similarities of the views of the attacker to Miller's own views have any impact on Miller or on Miller's role in the administration? Any thoughts on that?
So I don't know if he, if that had an impact on him. I know that, after the Dylan Roof shootings, Stephen Miller was very concerned about the reaction towards Confederate flags and, telling Breitbart to attack Amazon for its selling of like Che Guevara flags, as if Confederate and Che Guevara flags are on par, and getting very offended about the attack on Confederate symbols. So that's kind of like the only direct link that I can make. But yeah, I mean, throughout, through numerous white terrorist shootings, have involved this idea that there's this invasion at the border, and that that white people are being systematically replaced by brown and black people. This idea of white genocide, which is part of this book called The Camp of the Saints, this very white supremacist book about the destruction of the white world by brown and black people, that Stephen Miller read and was inspired by and promoted through Breitbart in 2015. So, there's right. This very interesting parallel between what white terrorists say and the ideas that Stephen Miller is pushing in the White House.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Here's another good question. Marcela Garcia asks, what role do you see Stephen Miller playing in a post-Trump world? Say Biden wins the presidency, where does Miller go? Do you see him running for public office?
So I really don't know what's going to happen to Stephen Miller. Initially he wanted to be a senator. He thought he'd be a prosecutor for a little while and then become a senator, but obviously his career took a different path. So it is possible that he would run for office somewhere. I think Stephen Miller is always going to have allies in the far right and nativist and white nationalist movements. So Stephen Miller, I think, is going to continue to have a community no matter what happens in November. I think it's just a question of whether these movements are going to be relegated to the fringes come November or not.
Got it. And here's a question from someone who points out that our discussion has seemed maybe a little bit ahistorical, that in the past, there have been other commissions of both Democrats and Republicans who over the years have advocated for fewer legal immigrants to come into the U.S. And this goes back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, including sometimes prominent Democrats who at various points in their careers, when the electorate looked different, sounded a lot different on immigration issues. So this person asks, what is our basis for calling Miller and Trump anti-immigrant in light of that historical flirtation over the years by a number of people on both sides of the aisle with restricting immigration? Where does Miller, in this historical sweep, where does Miller depart and go off in a much more radical direction, in your view?
Well, Stephen Miller has taken it to an unprecedented extreme where we're shutting down refugee admissions and the asylum system at the U.S.-Mexico border in a way that we've not seen before. I mean, but I do think it's important to point out that this isn't something that Trump and Stephen Miller invented, and this is part of what I try to show in the book. The fact that Trump and Stephen Miller are the logical outcome of a decades-long bipartisan assault on immigrants at the border, this scapegoating of immigrants that's been going on for a very long time. Even the Obama administration kind of laid the framework for what we're seeing under Trump now by, with the record deportations and helping to marry the concepts of immigration and criminality in people's minds by, only bringing up immigration when you're talking about national security. And this is something that helped Trump and Stephen Miller do what they're doing today. And it's not an invention of theirs. And this is part of what I try to show in the book. Like, you cannot reckon with the forces of Stephen Miller and the forces of Donald Trump if you don't reckon with the movements that propelled them.
Got it. A question a little bit more about your craft than about Miller. What was it like to report this book? I mean, someone asks, here you're reporting on one of the most controversial figures inside the administration at a time when the administration is demonizing journalists. What was your experience like doing the actual legwork of the book? What kind of roadblocks did you hit?
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting experience. I mean, I had people, people who were close to Miller. I won't specify beyond that, but people who were close to Miller who, were very, who told me they were very afraid that they'd made a mistake by talking to me, and that, Stephen Miller was going to come after them. A lot of sources who were scared to speak to me because, Stephen Miller has become notoriously vindictive, and yeah, I mean, so that was kind of a struggle. It was trying to navigate that as a journalist and being able to, figure out like how to protect people and still be able to, provide important information. But yeah, I mean, as far as the process, I from the very beginning, I tried to immerse myself in the literature that had inspired Stephen Miller, his favorite books, and just trying to really get inside his head, in addition to interviewing over 100 people who knew him and looking at the court documents and the private correspondence and trying to really, figure out what makes this guy tick.
Yep, absolutely. And you've done, just to extend the question, you've done reporting obviously prior to the Trump administration, and you've reported on border issues, immigration before Trump entered office, and you've obviously done it during his presidency. Have there been, just from a personal anecdotal perspective, have there been major changes in what it feels like and looks like to do this work, over and above just the fact that you're reporting on absolute humanitarian horrors? I just wonder if you've, professionally felt like the landscape has changed the way you practice the craft in these last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes you all the more careful, right? Like you don't want to get anything wrong because I mean, you never want to get anything wrong, but you kind of have to go like the extra mile to make sure that you don't get anything wrong and that you have solid backing for everything that you write, because there is this tendency in this administration to go after journalists and to try to discredit them. And so, I hired a fact-checking team to comb through the entire manuscript and make sure that, I wasn't making some stupid mistake. And these are important things to do no matter who is in the White House. But I do feel like there's an added sense of needing to make sure that everything is bulletproof, because you could come under attack personally. Right. The other thing is my first book is a very personal book, and I delve into my family, and so knowing how journalists have been attacked by trolls, in the past, and doxing being a rising phenomenon, I had to go and like find ways to protect my family's information. So these are things that you wouldn't normally think of, but which are becoming an increasing concern.
Yeah. Here's a good question from Chris Leonard. He asks, given all of the reporting you've done on some of the deeper cultural forces that have influenced Stephen Miller, he wonders what you think might happen if Trump were to lose in November. To what extent is the white nationalist movement dependent on him? Will it retain any power in government if Trump were to leave office? How should we be thinking about that?
That's a great question. I think that it exists independently of Trump. It is part of why Trump came to power. However, I do believe that if Trump loses in November, that over time we are going to see it kind of, die away. I think that nationwide we're seeing the same thing that we saw in California in the 90s, because nationally white people are going to become a minority by 2050 or before that. And so there's a lot of white fear and white anxiety related to, the quote, browning of America. But as in California, California became an increasingly diverse place. There was no apocalypse. There was no third world takeover. People just began to celebrate multiculturalism and realize the strengths that it brings to the table. And I think that we're going to see that over the next, few decades and generations. People are going to become increasingly mixed and have, a greater capacity for identification with multiple groups and ways of being. And so I do think we're going to see tribalism kind of die down, nationally the way it did in California. But, in California, there's still, a real white nationalist movement. And I'm not sure if it's ever going to go away, but I'm optimistic that it's not, going to take over the country.
One final question for me as we kind of near the end. The pandemic has obviously allowed the Trump administration to do all sorts of things on the immigration front in the name of public health. And I wonder, given what you know, both about Miller's thinking and maneuvering inside the White House, and what you also know about how DHS has changed under the weight of Miller's pressure, what sorts of things right now give you concern? What sorts of areas in immigration policy should the public be paying attention to? Because obviously we're all bombarded right now with election stuff, with pandemic stuff, and meanwhile the administration is marching ahead on immigration policy. What should people be looking at? What should people be paying attention to?
Well, I think it's not just about immigration. Obviously, like anything that impacting people coming from other countries is something that we need to be wary of as something that comes from Stephen Miller. But one kind of important thing to mention is that Stephen Miller's, laser focus on the immigration agenda and on attacking families, and less so on attacking, cartels and traffickers and things like that. That has created a situation where it has left Americans more vulnerable to a range of real threats, like the pandemic that we're seeing today. Resources were diverted from FEMA in order for migrant detention, And this has created a situation where like it's not just about worrying about immigration policy, although that is obviously a central concern, but it's also about looking at the broader national security question and how Stephen Miller's, extremism and ideology has impacted national security and the economy as a whole by kind of distracting from, focusing on distributing masks and medical equipment, and instead focusing on let's suspend green card access because we have to protect American workers based on this idea that, immigrants steal American jobs, or like, let's shut down the border because people are getting us sick from Mexico, even though there's more cases in the United States. So it's bigger than the immigration question. But just to quickly answer your question, like one of the policies that the Federation for American Immigration Reform recommended in their blueprint that Stephen Miller adopted almost verbatim in immigration
and just so everyone knows, this is one of the far right restrictionist think tanks that you've been making reference to in the conversation. I just wanted to clue people into what FAIR is. Keep going.
Thank you. Yeah. So one of the policies that he hasn't yet, got pushed through or really made a concerted effort on is revoking birthright citizenship as a right. So having the right to citizenship if you're born here. He has, criticized it. He's talked about it. Trump has talked about it. But I think that if we see a second term, it is something that they're going to become all the more focused on.
I realize I said that, final questions, and I reserve the right as moderator to revise that and ask just a few more just before we send everyone home. Because you mentioned birthright citizenship, and you mentioned things like this, which have just, actually come up before. I mean, Republicans and Democrats have towed that line at different points in very recent history. But there's always been a roadblock to that kind of radical action, because presumably Congress continues to exercise its function and write laws in this country. Right now, we're living in a moment where Congress has just been completely dysfunctional. How important is that to someone like Miller? Has Miller been able to do things that he otherwise wouldn't have had Congress been pulling its weight?
I think so. I mean, he recognizes that when you have a Congress that's unable to do anything, it gives him a lot more power. Going back to his time working for Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, who later became the Attorney General, Stephen Miller really focused on derailing this historic bipartisan immigration reform bill that was being worked on in 2013 and 2014. And just creating wedge issues that divide people, not just based on their skin color, but based on their political ideology, and creating these gridlocks in Congress based on these wedge issues. So I think it's very important for Stephen Miller, and we'll just have to see how things change over the next few months, if at all.
Yeah. All right, here is my officially last question. And I'm channeling, just so everyone knows, this is not just me greedily asking final questions. I'm trying to call some of the questions I'm seeing in the comments. So obviously the world is on fire right now. It's completely overwhelming just following all of the news. This book comes out. You've spent a lot of time on it. You've meticulously reported it. What do you hope readers take away from reading this book at this moment? And I realize that you could probably answer this question a million different ways, but if you had to give sort of one or two or three kind of broad takeaways on what you hope this book brings into public view right now, how would you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if you want to understand the era of polarization and division that we're living today, you have to understand the story of Stephen Miller. And so I hope that my book helps people to get some perspective on how we came to be so divided as a country, because it's something that Stephen Miller has exploited and been able to weaponize and further increase through the purposeful demonization, not just of people of color, but of any of their liberal allies. And so I think that's, that's one of the key takeaways is trying to understand this era of polarization and how Stephen Miller's story is sort of a microcosm for how we got here. And secondly, I think it's just important for people to connect the dots themselves, using the book as a resource between the immigration policies that we're seeing now and the white supremacists and the white nationalists that Stephen Miller has been drawing these policies from, so that we truly understand that this is not about national security. It is not about protecting the American economy. It is about changing the demographic flows into this country to, make sure that America remains a majority white country, because Stephen Miller believes that that is essential for its existential survival.
Jean, it's been great chatting with you. Congratulations on the book. I wish you didn't have to write it, but I'm very glad that you have. And so I hope everyone goes out and buys HateMonger. Jean Guerrero, congratulations again.
Thank you so much, John. Great talking with you.
So I guess we just sign off now. We just drop the mic and leave the chat, and that's that, huh?